The storm hit like it had a grudge against my farmhouse, and then someone started slamming on my door like their life depended on it. Because it did. "Please help me!" A boy's voice, barely breathing. Then police sirens cutting through the dark. I hid him. I opened the door pretending I was half asleep, and the officer standing in the rain, soaked to the bone under his hat brim, was my own son. What he said next made my blood run cold. "My name is Howard Gaines, 65 years old, 19 years an Army Ranger. I came home to this farm in Crossville, Tennessee, with a bad shoulder and the kind of quiet that settles into a man once the loudest years of his life are behind him. My wife Carol died 8 years ago. Our only son, Derek, is 46 now. County sheriff, married to a woman named Sandra, and a man who calls me Les every year. I'd left him a voicemail 3 weeks earlier asking him to Thanksgiving. He never called back. I told myself it was the job. That night, my dog Ranger went rigid in the middle of the kitchen. No bark, no pacing, just a low, urgent sound I'd learned in 5 years never to ignore. Then something hit my front door. Not a knock, fists. I opened it and a boy fell into my arms, maybe 16, soaked through, a cut bleeding above his eyebrow, eyes blown wide with the kind of terror that doesn't fake itself. I pulled him inside, sat him down, cleaned the wound while his teeth chattered. His name was Tyler Cole. His father, Raymond Cole, was a lawyer in town. Tonight, men had stormed his office. Tyler had hidden in a closet and heard everything fall apart on the other side of the door, until his father cracked it open, just long enough to shove a hard drive into his hands and whisper 3 words. "Run west." Then a crash. Then Tyler ran, and didn't stop until he hit my porch. Ranger crossed the kitchen and pressed his head into the boy's arm, something he never did with strangers. I was still processing that when Ranger's ears snapped forward. Headlights were swinging through my gate, one set flashing blue and red. I hid Tyler in the crawlspace under my utility room floor, wiped away the mud he'd tracked, and walked to the door with my heart slamming against my ribs. I opened it to find my son in full uniform, 2 deputies flanking him, rain dripping off his hat. "Sorry to bother you this late, Dad," Derek said, warm in that careful, performed way. "We've got a situation in town. Suspect fled a law office. 16, 17, dark hair. He asked if I'd seen anyone. I told him no, hadn't been out since supper. He asked to let his men look around. I said of course. I stood in my kitchen listening to boots cross the exact floorboards under which Tyler was crouched in the dark, holding his breath. Derek wandered the room the way he always had, touching things, cataloging. His eyes drifted to a shelf above the wood stove, an old radio, a Bible, and a folded scrap of paper I'd carried in my wallet for 20 years, the direct line to an FBI field office in Nashville. His gaze lingered on it 1 beat too long. The deputies came back clean. Derek turned to leave, then stopped at the door with his back to me, and his voice changed, all the warmth gone, replaced by something flat and deliberate. "This is old country out here, Dad. Walls are thin. Things happen in the dark that nobody ever finds out about." A pause. "Lock your doors tonight. Don't go looking into things that have nothing to do with you." Then he was gone into the rain. I pulled Tyler out of the crawlspace. He was shaking, the hard drive still clutched to his chest. "That man," he whispered. "Do you know who he is?" "He's my son," I said. Tyler's legs gave out. I caught him, sat him down. "You hid me from him," he said, hollowed out. I didn't answer, because there wasn't a version of the truth that made it easier. Ranger pressed against him again, and slowly his shoulders stopped shaking quite so hard. The password on the drive was his late mother's initials. Inside were case files, and then one folder with no name. Gaines. Do not open without authorization. My name, my social security number, my farm, all 43 acres, described in the cold language of a property transfer. Beneath it, a durable power of attorney, my forged signature at the bottom, citing a psychiatric evaluation, claiming I suffered cognitive decline. An evaluation supposedly conducted during a week I was out of state at a funeral. Raymond Cole had found it 4 months ago while working an unrelated case, recognized the forgery, and spent months quietly building proof. Proof someone had discovered, which was why his office was now a crime scene. A note in his handwriting explained the rest. Sandra Gaines, my daughter-in-law, had initiated contact with a company called Blackwood Development 3 years earlier. The sale of my farm was structured to close within 60 days of the power of attorney being filed. It hadn't been filed yet. My farm was still mine. I called my old sergeant. No answer. Then I unfolded that 20-year-old scrap of paper and dialed the FBI. A woman named Agent Patricia Walsh answered on the second ring. I told her everything: the forged documents, the falsified homicide report, the 16-year-old witness in hiding, the hard drive tying a development company to a coordinated fraud operation. She told me Blackwood had been under federal investigation for 18 months, and Tennessee had been the missing piece. The sheriff, she said carefully. Is he related to you? He's my son. The next morning I drove into Crossville and watched from an alley behind Raymond's office as Derek handed a folder to the county medical examiner, Dr. Marcus Webb. Webb read it, shook his head, and Derek put a hand on his shoulder and waited until Webb signed anyway. Then Derek told a deputy to approach Tyler with extreme caution. In cop language, that phrase meant one thing: don't bother bringing him back alive. I dropped Tyler with my neighbor Marge Tully, an old friend who fed you within 5 minutes of walking through her door. She told me her own story then, how Derek had come to her table 2 years ago, threatened to reopen an old case against her son, and made her sign away 3 acres of her land. She'd stayed silent to protect me, she said, and had hated herself for it every day since. That afternoon, a text arrived from an unknown number. They're coming tonight. I called it back. A deputy named Roy Callahan was on the other end, voice shaking. He'd been outside Raymond's office the night of the attack. He hadn't gone in, but he'd heard everything, including Derek's order to hunt down a 16-year-old, with extreme caution. He couldn't carry that anymore. He told me Derek and Sandra were coming for the drive, and the boy, tonight, after midnight, and that Sandra was the one giving the orders. I gave him Walsh's number and told him to go home. Then I called Walsh myself. By midnight, Walsh and her team had turned my farmhouse kitchen into a surveillance operation disguised as an ordinary evening. Hidden cameras, a warrant signed that afternoon, everything by the book. I called Derek and played the fool, found a strange drive in my desk, Raymond Cole's name on it, couldn't get it open. Could he come take a look? I heard the calculation in his silence before he agreed. They arrived just after midnight, Derek in plain clothes instead of his uniform, playing the dutiful son, Sandra a step behind him, composed, sweeping the room with eyes that were clearly hunting for cameras. Ranger planted himself between us the moment she spoke. "Where is Tyler Cole?" she asked, dropping all pretense. I told my son he didn't have to be here. "Yes, he does," Sandra said, before he could answer for himself, and something in the way he swallowed that told me everything about the shape of their marriage. I told Derek I'd heard every word he said on my porch the night before. I told him I knew what Sandra had built and what he'd done to help her build it. Something broke open in his face. Real, unmanaged pain. And Sandra stepped in to shut it down. Ranger growled and put himself bodily between her and me. I asked her how long she'd been planning it. 3 years and 4 months, she said, flat and precise, like reciting a quarterly report. A state land corridor study had flagged my farm as the anchor parcel. She'd needed someone with local authority, and Derek had $80,000 in business debt he was ashamed of when they met. She'd cleared it. He'd never asked where the money came from. "You didn't want to know," she told him. "That was our arrangement." Derek's composure cracked completely. "You used me," he said, "the whole time." That's when the kitchen flooded with light. Federal agents at every door. Walsh stepped out of the hallway with her badge raised. "Sandra Gaines, step away from the door." For 3 full seconds, the woman who'd planned everything looked afraid. Then the wall went back up, slower this time, less convincing. She was arrested trying to slip out the back, walking straight into 2 more agents already waiting. Walsh played back the recording, Sandra's own voice, laying out 3 years of calculated betrayal in that same flat boardroom tone. Derek stood in the middle of my kitchen and listened to his wife describe the architecture of his ruined life. Then Walsh arrested him too. Obstruction, elder financial abuse, conspiracy. He held out his hand to me before they walked him out. I looked at it a long moment. Then I put my hand on Ranger's head instead. He nodded, like he understood, and walked into the dark. Outside, Roy Callahan walked out of the tree line with his hands raised, surrendering, ready to cooperate. I stood on the porch with Ranger leaning against my leg and felt, for the first time in weeks, something like quiet. Then Walsh told me there was something else. Something about Raymond Cole. I braced for the worst. Instead, Dr. Webb showed up on my porch at dawn, coat rumpled, guilt written into every line of his face. He told me the truth he'd been carrying. Derek had blackmailed him into falsifying Raymond's death certificate, but Raymond hadn't died. Webb had quietly diverted him to a private clinic instead, kept him alive under a false name, and he'd woken up the day before, asking for his son. I didn't wait to hear the rest. I drove to Marge's house faster than I should have. Tyler was on the kitchen floor, hollow-eyed, waiting for news he was afraid to hope for. One look at my face told him it wasn't bad news. He came apart right there on the floor, and I sat down beside him while he cried the kind of cry that had been compressed for days and finally had room to finish. At the clinic, I let him walk into that room alone. Through the door, I heard one word, "Dad," and then a silence so full it was almost its own sound. When Tyler came out, his face was wrecked and grinning at the same time. He squeezed my hand, he said. He said good, that's all he needed to know. The trial came 3 months later. Webb testified first, plainly, without asking for sympathy. Roy Callahan testified next, voice shaking, telling the judge on record that he should have come forward sooner. Then Tyler took the stand and told the truth the way his father had taught him, without embellishment, without tears, until his voice caught once remembering his father's voice through a closet door. Sandra Gaines was convicted on wire fraud, RICO violations, conspiracy, and elder financial abuse, 12 to 15 years. Derek was convicted of obstruction, conspiracy, and elder financial abuse, but the judge noted a phone call he'd made to Walsh in January, cooperating voluntarily, confirming Sandra's timeline without being asked. 4 years, parole possible at 2. The judge looked at him before she read the sentence. "A badge is not a birthright," she said, "and a son is not above the law he swore to uphold." I sat in the back row and felt something too complicated to name. Loss and relief tangled together. The particular exhaustion of a love that had survived something it was never supposed to survive. Spring came back to the plateau the way it always does. In arguments, warm days followed by frost, green pushing up and getting knocked back down until it finally holds. Marge showed up with oat bread and apple butter and didn't argue when I told her not to. Roy Callahan showed up one Tuesday with work gloves on his belt and spent 3 hours resetting fence posts without saying much, and near the end said quietly that he knew it didn't fix anything. "It fixes the fence," I told him. He almost laughed. Raymond called to thank me properly, his voice steadier now than it had been in that hospital bed. "You kept my son alive," he said. "You didn't hesitate. I told him he raised a good kid. He told me I had too. I just had to find him." That evening, I took the old radio down from the shelf above the wood stove, the one that had sat there for years, waiting for a purpose it had finally served, and put it away in a drawer. Some things had done their work. It was time to let them rest. The next morning I was fixing the front gate before sunrise, and Tyler showed up late, pulling on work gloves, Ranger trotting at his heels like a dog with a job to do. "My dad says justice is slow," Tyler told me, hammering a nail into the crossbar, "but it remembers everything." I drove the last nail home and felt the gate hold solid under my hand. "Your dad was right," I said. He asked what happens now. I looked at the pasture, the horses moving easy in the low field, the oak trees showing green at the tips for the first time all year. "Now we fix what needs fixing," I said, "same as every morning. If there's one thing this cost me the truth to learn, it's this. The most dangerous betrayal never comes from a stranger. It comes from someone who already knows exactly where you keep your trust and decides to spend it anyway. Don't wait for the damage to ask the hard questions. Don't mistake silence for safety. or distance for peace. The people you love deserve the version of you that shows up before everything breaks, not after.